happy to see so many in the audience, and not in the least surprised, because our guest is somebody a lot of people have wanted to know more about for a good long time, none perhaps more than me. I've never met Shane Bauer until about an hour ago, and it's a great pleasure. Really happy you could be here.
Likewise.
And it's a fantastic occasion because, as you may have heard yesterday, Shane won the National Magazine Award for reporting for his piece about being a private prison guard, and Mother Jones Magazine won Magazine of the Year. National Magazine, it's a big deal. Yeah. So it's extra great to welcome you here today. And I'm sure you're almost all recovered from yesterday's
pretty much
celebration. Yeah. Okay, good. As a lot of you know, Shane and I have in common being writers who worked for some time in state prisons to shed light on what goes on inside that those on the outside are not allowed to learn about. But I'd say we arrived at our decision to seek that work in very different ways. I had done immersive projects among railroad tramps and Mexican migrants and a couple of other groups, and I like immersion as a reporting strategy, even if there's not something rotten to uncover necessarily, though certainly when I got a job in New York State Corrections, I expected there would be. Shane, you came to the prison beat from a different place. As a lot of you know, Shane was held prisoner by Iran for 26 months.
Yep.
Along with his friend Josh and his friend, now wife Sarah. They were all arrested while hiking in Iraqi Kurdistan. Mm-hmm. And so Shane understands prison in a way I don't. I'm grateful that I don't. And yet it makes your choice of prison as a topic especially interesting. I first read your work at length when I was researching a piece for Vanity Fair about solitary confinement at Guantanamo, which, as you know, is sort of modeled on the American system of segregation, ADSEG, and there are many examples in the U.S. of extreme solitary confinement, including Pelican Bay in Northern California, which was a topic of your long and incredibly well-sourced piece on solitary confinement in Mother Jones that came out 2 years ago?
I think it was maybe 4 now.
4?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was 2012.
Yeah, 5.
Yeah. So only later did I read your prison guard story, and then only after that did I read your memoir of being a prisoner in Iran, which is your first book. Mm-hmm. So when my book about working at Sing Sing came out, I have a neighbor who taught there, who thought that essentially I had betrayed the progressive cause by accepting employment as a prison guard. Huh. He had a very strong reaction against it. Did you have to overcome any resistance to taking on that role?
From other people?
Or yourself?
I didn't get it from other people, which I was kind of surprised by, actually. I expected some of the same kind of response. For myself, I mean, yeah, there was a lot to overcome. I mean, if you're a prisoner, prison guard is pretty much the worst thing that there is, you know? And so, you know, to go into that role, and, you know, you can't fully comprehend what that means before you do it. And, you know, I decided to become a guard more, I think maybe this is a way that our ideas differed when we went in. For me, I wasn't doing it so that I could write about being a guard. You know, I knew that would probably be a part of it, but I was more doing it because that was the only way I could get into the prison that I, for more than like 5 hours or something. So then at some point, I was like, okay, I'm a prison guard, and it was challenging to kind of overcome that kind of a feeling of guilt in a way of just locking people up, as somebody who had been locked up for a couple of years.
And who'd been mistreated in other ways by prison guards.
Yeah. And I really, wanted to be kind of a good guy guard, I would just like do what I could to help people out, be friendly, all of that stuff.
Right.
And that was how I just assumed that I would do that, but also kind of eased that kind of strange feeling of stepping into those shoes. But that didn't last very long.
Let's come back to that. One thing we were talking about in the last half hour was how long it took me to get hired by New York State as a prison officer, about 3 years, and how quickly Shane succeeded in getting hired as a private prison guard in Louisiana by the Corrections Corporation of America. Can you tell, a lot of the people in the audience have read your article and know some of the story, but can you tell how you ended up in that job, and was it just good fortune that you were at a place so dysfunctional as the Wynn Correctional Center?
So the way that I got the job is I applied online, went to the corporate website, filled out an application, didn't lie in the application. I listed my current employer, and I checked in with my editors before doing this. They said, go for it, just don't lie. But it was kind of like, we were all like, this isn't going to happen, but might as well try.
You figured they wouldn't hire you?
Yeah, I mean, it just seemed like a shot in the dark, and then a couple weeks later, I got phone calls asking for interviews, and I had several options. I mean, even when I fill out an application, you kind of click the box next to, what prisons you want to apply to, and I just kind of randomly clicked, 5 or 6. And so then I started getting calls from all of them, and so then I had options of where I wanted to work, and I didn't know anything about Wynn, and there was really nothing online about it. It was just another prison. There's a lot you can find about Louisiana prisons, but you mostly find stuff about Angola, the maximum security prison. So yeah, I mean, I guess it was luck, but also it didn't seem that different from, there were guards there that were filling in from other prisons, so I got to talk to people about what their prisons were like, and not that they were all the same, and some of these guys were coming from prisons that were less chaotic, but they had been to a lot of them that were in similar situations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I originally wanted to work at an immigrant detention center, but that also included an ICE background check, and I just worried that maybe that would kill all my chances, so I just went for Louisiana.
Right.
Yeah, but I was choosing between Louisiana and Oklahoma in the end, and Louisiana just seemed like a better place to live, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And also it has the largest prison population per capita in the world, so I thought that would be also, I'd be getting inside private prisons, but also just getting inside the Louisiana system was a draw.
And you intentionally chose a prived prison?
Yeah.
Would you have worked in a regular state prison?
I had always thought about private prisons,
Mm-hmm.
Because there was so little known about them. Private prisons weren't something I hadn't written about them before.
Yeah.
I'd written about public prisons, but they were so secretive.
Right.
And also, you had your book, and I never considered really kind of doing that same thing.
Uh-huh.
It was just like, it just seemed like an opportunity to get inside this system that has existed since the 80s, but we've like very really seen hardly anything of.
Right, right. We were talking earlier also about how earlier in American history, for example, in 1826, when Sing Sing was built, it was important to taxpayers that it be self-sustaining. And so prison industry was the answer to that. There were little factories built on the Hudson River between the cell blocks and the water, where prisoners would work during the day in big shops that made all different kinds of things, and politically connected factory owners would try to make an arrangement to get a factory there, and the proceeds defrayed the cost of the prison. You went to a part of the country where I think the historic model was the plantation.
Right.
Do you see any through line to private prisons?
Yeah, I mean, the Angola is still a prison farm. When the prison I was at is not. That was a way at that time that states were trying to save money by selling food and cotton,
Mm-hmm.
mostly cotton and also sugar cane, and also to defray the costs of clothing and feeding prisoners and stuff like that. And that prison model kind of ended in the 70s.
So, when you arrived on the job, I imagine most of your co-workers were people from the immediate area.
Yeah.
I arrived on a job at a USDA detail at a Cargill Meat Solutions factory in Nebraska a couple years ago, and everybody wanted to know what I was doing there from New York.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, everybody needs a break from New York now and then.
Yeah.
And they said, yeah, I get that. And
Yeah.
I said, in New York, you can pay a couple $1,000s a month for a studio apartment. And they all nod, yeah, I get that. And the apartment I rented in Schuyler, Nebraska was $350 a month, utilities included, one bedroom. And so in a way, I deflected questions like that.
Yeah. No, that's really similar to the things that
Tell
I
me,
said.
so you chose to live in a town where you wouldn't run into a lot of
Right.
prison employees?
Mm-hmm.
Tell about that.
Well, part of that decision was that the town Winfield, which is the town that the prison is next to, it's a really hard up town, and I kind of drove through it, and was kind of like, I want to see what the next town looks like. So I drove like 45 minutes further to Natchitoches, which is kind of a historic little town. There's a river, there's like a few restaurants, and also less of the prison employees live there. The idea was that the thought had crossed my mind at some point that maybe I should do this Barbara Ehrenreich style and also try to live on $9 an hour while I'm doing this, but I realized I was gonna have to live in a trailer park. I had to have all my gear there, my computer, my cameras, and also I was, I just knew that the job was gonna be really tolling, take a big toll. So I dropped the idea pretty quickly, and so I wanted to kind of have somewhere that when it wasn't in a prison, I was just as far from it as I could be, psychologically, which included not feeling like I was going to run into somebody from the prison whenever I was out. Okay. But people would ask me why I came from California, and I would say you never know where life's going to take you and stuff like that. But I think the prisoners actually were more tuned into that.
Uh-huh.
You know, guards would ask, and I would kind of say something like that. Sometimes I would also talk about like rents, and they wouldn't really go further. But there were prisoners sometimes that would just say to me, you know, there's something about you. You're looking for something.
Right. Right.
And I assumed that they thought I wanted to bring in drugs or something,
Mm-hmm.
and that I was kind of trying to feel them out.
Yeah.
But several of them kind of had a feeling something was up.
Right.
I mean, I would just stand there and ask them questions a lot, you know?
So, yeah, I often thought one of the biggest impediments to my success as a prison officer was my curiosity and like
Yeah.
my liberal arts education.
Uh-huh.
Like I was curious.
Yep.
And being a journalist, you ask questions
Yeah.
and you're with all these people who've ended up in a terrible place and you
Mhm.
want to know how
Right.
that happened. And it's hard to pretend you don't care.
Yeah. I mean, even when I was in training, I felt like that was making me stand out.
Yeah.
Just the fact that I was writing in a notebook.
Exactly.
Which was, to me, I was like, this is great. I can sit here and write my notebook as much as I want. Like, it's not going to look weird. But it did, because nobody else did that.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Same here. I was required to carry a notebook
Yeah.
in my breast pocket behind the
Yeah.
inmate standards of inmate behavior rule book. And it was perfect
Yeah.
for being a journalist, because not only would I write down their cell number or their inmate number and the time they had a visitor, I would write down their nicknames and the joke I heard that I was
Right.
at risk of forgetting
Yeah,
by the end
yeah,
of the day.
yeah.
And so I had an excuse, and if I was writing a lot, I'd step into my office cell
Uh-huh.
and write there. But even so, at least one prisoner and at least one fellow officer in the academy knew I didn't belong.
Mm.
Like, they just knew.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's kind of scary
Yeah. Yeah.
when you think you've given off no sign, but
Right.
apparently you have.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many cues.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I had a prisoner who got out after I left. I met him afterwards, and he claims that he knew. You know,
Yeah.
he said, "You were always writing that notebook."
Yeah.
You wrote something.
I had a prisoner say, he stopped me one day and said, what are you doing here, Conover? This seems like the wrong place for you. And I said, what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
He said, I don't know. Did you go to college? And I said, yeah, I did, actually. I did go to college. And he said, what did you study? I said, anthropology. He goes, anthropology? I said, that's a deep subject. What are you doing here? And I said, I'm just making a living. And he goes, you look like you should be a teacher, man. And I'm like, oh, give me a break. But I'm thinking, he's seen into my soul, you know?
Yeah.
And likewise, the guy I shared my bunk, I was on the top of a bunk with a guy who just completely mistrusted me and thought I was bogus. And
Yeah. Yeah, I remember you writing about that. And
Yeah.
I actually thought about that when I was working, because I had I don't think I wrote about this in the article, but I had a problem with another cadet who at one point threatened me. And it was just he was like 18, and a lot of the cadets were 18, and he had some, it was a prison on the lockdown one day. There had been an escape, and we had to bring food to the prisoners because they couldn't go out to the chow hall. So we were pushing a cart, and I asked him to push the cart, and he refused, and we had this little kind of bickering thing, and he was just like, you know, you don't want to mess with me. And he had already told me before that, he had shown me his scars where he had been stabbed. He said he was in a gang fight, that, you know, he had been in a gang, and so there was some tension for a while, you know.
Yeah.
But we got over it. Yeah.
So on that job, you occupied an extreme zone of journalism with its own circumstances and I think a set of rules that you established maybe partly in consultation with editors and lawyers and partly in consultation with yourself. You wrote, or in Columbia Journalism Review, you were quoted as saying, "I never lied when I was there. That was a ground rule. If somebody had figured it out and asked me if I was a journalist, I would have said yes." When you applied for the job, I read somewhere, you put your employer as the Foundation for National Progress, right? Which is Mother Jones. And Shane told me,
Parent company.
told me a little while ago that he supplied the main phone number of Mother Jones as for the employer phone number and had a chat with the receptionist. But what if that person isn't there one day? And yet you weren't Googled, and they didn't call you at work. It sounds like, right? Do you know what investigation they did do of who you were?
I think they did a criminal background check, which is outsourced to, I don't know who. It took like 24 hours. And I think that's it. Although when I did start, I had to go in to do a drug test before I started, and I met with HR, and the head of HR told me that somebody who was from the corporate office had called and asked about me. And she was like, "This doesn't usually happen. Do you know what this is about?" And I was like, "No, I don't." And so I was just like sweating for a week before the job started. And I just thought, okay, I'm here, but like, this is not gonna, my gig is up, And I had all these fantasies of like, I was gonna go in there, they're gonna be waiting. And, it was really nerve wracking. And nothing came of it. I don't know what it was about, or if he forgot or what.
I had some similar fears of being discovered on the job through some oversight, or I published an article while I was working at the prison that I'd begun months before, and it came out in the Times Magazine, and I thought, I'm dead, and discovered nobody there reads the New York Times.
And also, I also had the head of training once. I think, I don't remember, something came up, and maybe they wanted us to come in early to do shakedowns or something like that. And she told me the next day that she was trying to find me on Facebook to message me. She was Googling, and she was like, "Your name's Sean?" And I was like, "No, it's Shane." So she didn't happen to Google the right name, so that would have been it too.
So let's talk about the ground rules. No lying. What else?
I mean, for me, I think the most important thing is to, whatever the story is, and I think when you're doing this kind of work, the approach and the rules often change depending on what you're doing. And I think the most important thing is just to be completely transparent with the reader about what those rules are in that situation. So that's my main rule. And I think that, I mean, I don't really think that there are ground rules in journalism other than that you should tell the truth. And, these are things that are highly debated. And I think of this article I read over 10 years ago by Robert Fisk, and he was talking about reporting in Baghdad, and that he was criticizing kind of the major outlets because at that time it was too dangerous for reporters to go out into the city. So they would send out stringers, and they would come back and tell them what's going on, and they would write it up. And he said, that's fine to do that. It's dangerous, but like you should be telling us this in your articles. Like this is how this information is gathered, so that people can know what they're reading and make decisions about what to take from it. So I think that's key.
Transparency with readers. What about lack of transparency with subjects?
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I think transparency with readers is so important is because of the kind of ambiguous transparency with the subjects. So what I did in that story, and then in a later story that I did about militias, when I went undercover with right-wing militias, was before publishing the story, I reached out to everyone who was in it to give them a chance to respond, to try to get some more answer the questions I had, and to let them know I'm a journalist and see what they had to say about it, and that is stressful. It's not an enjoyable process.
Were any of them mad?
Maybe, but I think the ones that were mad just didn't respond.
Yeah.
I was mostly surprised at how many people did respond in both cases, in both stories.
Yeah.
With the militia story, I was very hesitant to do that because I was kind of afraid of those guys, and I didn't want them to feel like they had any access to me.
Right.
But a lot of them said, yeah. They didn't even complain about me being a journalist. It was kind of strange. The guards that responded were very excited about the fact that I was a journalist, and were excited to be a part of it.
And in your article, there's famously an exchange where somebody says an investigative journalist should come in here someday, see what they find.
Yeah. But I think I don't know. I guess it's hard to call these rules, but there is. It's a challenging space to be in, I think, because I think a strength of immersive reporting is that it's much harder to characterize people, and you get the complexities of people and their situations, and that's the reason to do it, in my opinion. And but you start liking people, and it feels a little bit strange sometimes to be in that place where they don't know what you're up to. And there was one point when I was training with California militias, which I didn't really write about much in the story, but I spent a few months going to these trainings out in the middle of nowhere in California with a couple militias, and we would do these trainings, kind of learning paramilitary exercises, and then they would all go out for dinner or something after. And I went one time, and I was there, and we were waiting for the table, and I just left, and it just felt like, I don't want to. It just felt weird stepping into that kind of personal space, and as critical as I was about what they're doing, it still felt kind of unfair, and I felt it just felt like too much, so I didn't do that.
So I haven't written, excuse me, I don't think I've written about this, but similarly on a Friday, every 2 Fridays we were paid. On payday, a lot of guys and women would go out drinking, and I was invited and went once, and also felt after a certain point I should leave.
Yeah.
And I was also invited to a couple of coworkers' houses on weekends to relax, watch football, and I said no because it felt wrong. I've never read this in a journalism text that you should avoid people's personal space, but I think a lot of the guidance for a journalist in our situation is how does that feel, and how would you feel if a journalist came into your house? And I think I'd feel differently if I'd welcomed them into my house than if I had met them on the job.
Right.
I think that there's a real difference there.
Yeah.
You only used people's names, their real names, after you contacted them and got their permission.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. So that was also a rule, was that I protect people's identities, unless they give me permission. There were questions that came up, in the editorial process of, well, does the warden get to be named? Should the warden be named or not? Stuff like that.
Right.
That's a little bit more ambiguous.
I'm trying to remember if you named the warden. I think
we
you
didn't.
did.
No,
oh,
we
you
didn't.
didn't.
We ended up not doing it.
Can I read another quote?
Yeah.
If I were not working at Wynn and were reporting on the prison through more traditional means, I would never know how violent it is. While I work here, I keep track of every stabbing that I see or hear about from supervisors or eyewitnesses. During the first 2 months of 2015, at least 12 people are shanked. To me, that's a justification for the deception
of undercover reporting,
Yeah.
that you are learning something important that you couldn't otherwise
Oh yeah.
learn.
Yeah.
Does that count as a rule for you, that you should
Yeah. Yeah. It does.
be finding out something like that?
Yeah, and then I guess for me there has to be a kind of public interest kind of aspect. I think, which is not clear cut. What does that mean exactly? But it is something that I'm gauging with myself, and that I can't really get it another way.
Right. So Mother Jones tweeted, I think, investigating and fact-checking this story took 18 months of nonstop work and $350,000.
Yeah.
And I've been asked, do you believe that?
Yeah.
And I do, because it's not just a desk for you,
Right.
and it's not just your plane ticket to Louisiana and your utility bills. It's a whole lot of, well, I don't know. What else is it? Tell me. What else figures in?
I mean, I spent a year and a half on that story. So there's that. Yeah, there's all the expenses of being in Louisiana.
A year and a half between applying and finishing your writing? Okay.
Yeah, and I reported the militia story during that time, so
Okay.
it's not the only thing I was doing, but it was the bulk of it.
Yeah.
There are fees for our lawyers, which spent a lot of time on that story. I mean, exhaustive amount of time on that story. That was actually why I did the militia story, because I was going to just rip my hair out if I sat and talked to lawyers for another month. So I had to do something. I went to my editors and said, I need you to let me do something else right now.
Yeah.
There were 3 fact checkers on the story that spent months on it. There was my main editor, Dave Gilson. There's art. There's James West, who's doing video. James West also got arrested. There were his legal fees.
Right.
That went on for many months. I don't know. At some point, there was most of the San Francisco office was working on this story for 2 to 3 months, and for a year before that, there was a core group of people that were mostly working on that story.
Right.
So there's a lot of people to pay.
Yeah. And as some of you know, in addition to the 35,000-word article, there's a 6-part video and a podcast, or several episodes.
Yeah, there's a radio documentary, and
Right.
then there's a bunch of interviews on podcasts.
And in aggregate, they've reached over 1 million readers, I've read.
Mm-hmm.
So this is nonprofit journalism. Should we support Mother Jones?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to check with that. I want to open it up to questions from our patient and engaged audience, but just one more question from me, which is, when I applied for a job at Sing Sing, the internet was young.
Yeah.
By the time my book was finished, I thought, I'm going to build a website with an email link so anybody who's unhappy can reach me and respond like that, instead of finding out where I live. And that's how I first thought about the internet and the web. Lately, I've thought about it in terms of how it might shorten the life of an undercover reporter, or it might shorten the useful duration of an undercover career, because if we use our real names, people can find us.
Yeah.
Do you think about that? Do you think that's real?
It's really interesting. Doing this kind of undercover work the last couple of years has shown me a lot about how people use the internet. People do not Google as much as I expect. The prison company didn't Google me, all the people I worked with, but also when I joined militias, those were hundreds of people, and none of them Googled me. And I mean, people ask me now, do you think you're going to get to keep doing this? Like, if you do, is there a point where you can't do this anymore? And I always say that it's always the same issue. It's always whether people Google me or not. You know, I mean, people don't know the names of journalists for the most part, or know their faces unless they're like TV anchors or something.
Right.
And something that has been interesting to me is to see how siloed people are on the internet. The Militia project really illuminated that. There's a way that the internet is kind of a risk for this kind of work, because we're just much more exposed potentially. People can access information about us more easily. But it also, in some ways, can make it easier to do this kind of work. And the Militia project, I joined militias through the internet. I mean, Facebook made it so much easier. I started a new Facebook page, and I just friended or followed a bunch of militia accounts, and then just sent friend requests to all the people on those accounts, and 70% of them accepted. So then I was in that world within 2 days, and at least in that kind of digital way. And I would just repost things that they posted, like blogs, about Obama declaring martial law or something, and just to keep my page active. I wouldn't, write things myself. I didn't want to be saying things I didn't believe, but I would just kind of repost stuff. And I saw that the things they post and the things that are posted on my normal Facebook account are entirely different. There's no crossover at all.
Yeah.
They're not reading the media I read. It's just it's such an insular world.
Yeah.
And I basically, through Facebook, found an announcement of a border operation and asked to join, and then I was going down there.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, it's still just a question of how invested people are in kind of looking into people.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier, and I do wonder if there is a time limit on this, in that, the people that I've been dealing with, like when I applied to the prison, the people that are taking my application are of a generation that has not internalized the internet. It's still secondary to them, and maybe in 20 years this will be a different question.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah. It's super interesting,
Yeah.
and the silo effect, how there was no overlap between what's passed between friends.
Yeah, and my prison story came out, and I felt like I had to finish the militia reporting before that story came out. And it never came up on that in my Facebook thing. Nobody was like, "Oh, this is the guy that was with us." It just never registered.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Can we take some questions?
Yeah. Great.
I hardly know where to begin.
We've got a microphone from James. Actually, you had your hand up first.
Hi. So there are a few really important characters in the piece, and a couple of those, I think, is Bauer, I believe his name was. Bagel, the other guard, and also Corner Store. And I'm wondering how you navigated kind of forming relationships with them and kind of fostering a bond with them when you couldn't be totally truthful.
Right.
So that, I mean, they gave you a lot of information and even appeared in the videos after. And so how did you foster those relationships while you were undercover?
Well, with Bagel, I didn't really have a choice. I was with him 12 hours a day. And, I think this is something I've thought about just in regards to the question of kind of undercover reporting. There is the kind of question that comes up a lot about deception, and is it okay to do that? And I think a lot about the deception that exists throughout journalism, and I think that a lot of journalists are deceptive in ways that, they're not necessarily upfront about what they're getting at with the story. When we're often hiding something. We might hear somebody say something and not then say, "Oh, by the way, I'm a journalist. I just heard you say that. Are you okay with me reporting that?" Or and I think the other big issue that happens a lot in journalism is that we have a kind of a topic an issue that we want to dig into, and then we go on the search for a character to embody that. And I think it's inevitable that in that search, the person we're trying to find somehow reflects our view of the situation. And when you're immersing, you don't get to do that. You just have whoever shows up. And when I first was put on the job with Bakel, I was kind of like, man, this is the guy. Like, I was a little disappointed, that this is the guy that is going to be my main guard character. He talks a lot, and it took a lot of weeding through, things that he was talking about to get to the good stuff, and but that's life. I mean, that's in a way a lot more honest. I think it's a more honest representation, and everybody is interesting in some way. It's just a challenge of kind of getting at the kernel of a person. And so, Bakel and I would, when we weren't taking prisoners in and out, we're just sitting there. I mean, there's so much time when you're a guard that you're just sitting around, and he would just talk, and I would just sit there and listen. And he would tell me about, Civil War reenactments. He'd talk ad nauseum about being in the Coast Guard. We're just sitting there in our chairs, and I could ask him whenever I wanted. And but then there's also just a natural camaraderie that happens, because we're basically the only people that have each other's backs. And, so you're in a dangerous situation, and you're there to defend the other person. So, there's just something that kind of automatically happens. And then with Corner Store, he was different, and I was always wanting to get to know prisoners, and there are other prisoners. There's at least one that I had a relationship with who was very different, who didn't end up in the article because I just felt like I had to choose one. But Corner Store was a natural choice because he was just around the guards a lot, and he kind of played this role of being in between the guards and the prisoners. And he was really talkative, so I could just kind of, he liked the fact that we let him out of his dorm, and so he would just sit and chat with us, and so I could just kind of ask him questions, and he said a lot more than I expected he would. He wouldn't, he had a line. There were things that if I tried to ask him about, like one time I asked him to teach me some prisoner lingo, and he was like, no, he did not ever. He was very clear that he was not a snitch, and he didn't really make a show of it, but he wasn't going to sell anybody out. So that was kind of established. But I could ask him about this kind of prison life, and he would talk about it.
I used to think about how I would escape if I were a prisoner, and one day I asked a prisoner I was friendly with, "Do you ever think about how you'd escape?" He goes, "I'm not going to talk about that with you." I was just trying to build a bridge.
Right, yeah. But there were times that there were interesting conversations. There was one prisoner I talked to a lot, and I told him I was from Oakland, and I just started talking to him about the Black Panthers, and he was like, "What?" He was like, "What do you know about the Black Panthers?" And he knew a lot about the Black Panthers, and then we just, started talking about it, and we kind of developed a rapport around that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I guess George Jackson never came up in Louisiana, but that would probably be something I would avoid, because prison administrations do not like George Jackson. They don't like you talking about him.
Right.
Yeah. California people end up in solitary confinement for years for having books by George Jackson.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. If you don't know, he was shot, and he was an activist shot and killed by a tower guard, if I'm not mistaken, at was it at Soledad?
San Quentin, right?
San Quentin.
Yeah. No, he had been in Soledad and wrote a book at that time, but he was shot at San Quentin.
Okay. Well, you have the microphone.
I do. Just a couple, like one's a quicker question than the other, I guess. The first is related to what Natalie asked, which is, we were talking about this when we discussed the article in class, about how you navigated kind of prisoner consent. So I guess there's like kind of an understanding that they're wards of the state and thus like can't consent to certain things. So especially when you're recording people in secret or using dialect or anything like that, like things that are identifying even though you're not using their name. What are kind of the editorial choices there, or how do you go into that? And the second is, to what extent are you communicating with people at home when you're immersed? Are you like calling your girlfriend, or are you calling the office?
Yeah.
How do you interact?
Yeah, that's a good question. The consent stuff was something we talked about a lot, and both ethically and legally, and which are pretty different questions. But I mean, we would basically just kind of try to remove identifying information. I don't think that anybody was identifiable by dialect, because people kind of all spoke the same there, for the most part, white and black. And you know, someone like Corner Store, he's the prisoner that is the most identifiable, but he is somebody I talked to a lot afterwards, and kind of we talked through a lot of that stuff. He, you know, agreed to be videotaped without his face being used. You know, I told him that I was going to call him Corner Store, you know, and he didn't love that nickname, but he agreed. He agreed to it. I was like, "Do you have something better?" He never came up with anything, but but you know, he was okay with that that level. You know, I told him that I had been. That our conversations were in the story and stuff, and I think most other people were much less identifiable. But there was I wrote about a sexual assault that happened. That was something we talked about a lot, and you know, because there it's like there's just a lot that you're identifying about somebody. You know, that it's like identifying somebody for, I mean, he hadn't been raped in that situation, but I described that he was, you know, what is called a punk in prison, where he was kind of had this guy who essentially owned him. Yeah, and I don't want to put that out about somebody without them consenting to it. So, you know, I basically just described that I think that he was like a skinny white guy. So there's a lot of those, you know, so, and really in prison, like people, even like the time that he was there, I mean, people are moving around so fast, it's just so hard for like anybody to peg down any of that stuff, you know, who is where, when. Oh, and then your other question, what was it again?
Like how much are you talking to?
Yeah. I was, yeah. I talked to Sarah regularly. She came and visited a couple times for a couple stretches for a few weeks. She was actually there at the very end. And I talked to family and some close friends. I told close friends that I was doing it, but yeah, a lot of people didn't know. I disappeared from social media, but I mean, even I actually didn't talk to friends as much as I thought I would. It's such a leap, you know. I mean, I was so deep in it, and if I would talk to friends, I would just be like vomiting on the phone about like all of the crazy things happening, and then it would be like, that's an hour, so I don't know, talk again in a month or something, you know. Yeah, I mean, I also talked to, for a little bit, I was like talking to my therapist on the phone, but it was hard to kind of step outside of that world. Like, you know, I had a question when I went down there if I would ever just go home for a little bit to visit, and when I got there, I did not want to do that. It just seemed like it'd be too jarring. And yeah, I mean, but that is like, I think that is something that I didn't realize how big of a deal it would be, the level of isolation of doing that kind of work. And, you know, I couldn't really make friends there, you know. I mean, I met some people like at the local bar. I hung out with somebody once. He invited me. I went to like his trailer park. But it was like, you know, I can't really tell this guy like much about myself, so you can't really have like a real friendship based on that. Let alone the fact that like we're really from entirely different worlds, you know. Yeah, so that was a challenge.
Question from this side, yeah.
Actually, I had the same questions as Ula, but I'll try to think of a new one. So I would be curious to hear from both of you, because Ted, you went in without a specific assignment and without working with a specific outlet, whereas you had like full kind of staff ready to help you. And I was wondering if you guys could talk about what you see looking back, like was that beneficial for your situation, or did that have some unintended consequences, things like that?
Well, it's pretty great, I think, to have an organization behind you, like somebody who will know things go wrong for you, and they have your back if you run into trouble, and if you got injured, you might still make your salary for a couple weeks at least.
Yeah.
And to have built-in legal help
Yeah.
is pretty great.
Yeah.
There aren't that many places that provide that. A lot of major media is still skeptical about undercover reporting and explicitly doesn't do it. I felt I had that with Harper's for the first time ever when I did my meat inspector story, and it felt good to have them there. I had the benefit of having published books before I got my job at Sing Sing, so I felt if it worked out, I'd be able to publish again. But I didn't seek a book contract while I was in there because I thought this could all fall apart. I could be discovered, I could be hurt, I could be fired for whatever reason, and I don't want to be on the hook with a publisher, and that was a little scary. On the other hand, I was making a salary, just under $30,000, and I got health insurance from my job. So it wasn't as bad as your job. In certain states that have unions, especially, prison work is a little better paid.
Yeah.
And
so you had institutional support from Harper's when you did the factory job?
When I did the meat inspection story, yeah. They were, I had an expense limit, right? So I made a scouting trip, and when I needed a lawyer's opinion, I got to talk to their lawyer.
Yeah.
When I worked at Sing Sing, I talked to a friend of mine from grad school who became a lawyer, and who was just nice enough to talk to me, and who happened to be really smart on First Amendment issues. So, if you're on your own, you have to cobble together the pieces a little more.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think it was better having institutional support for that story. I mean, one, I would have been making $9 an hour, and then nothing for a long time. But the legal backing is huge. And just knowing that if I get sued, it's not gonna like destroy my life, that's a huge deal, to know that, and it just changes how bold you can be in the story too, or not feel afraid of that backlash. And I don't know, as for drawbacks, I can't really think of drawbacks for the prison story, and the militia story, I might have gone longer, that was like a neat, when I did the border operation, that was like, okay, this is like perfect thing for a magazine story. But had I been on my own, maybe I would have like joined some other groups, maybe gotten into other aspects of the far right, and turned it into like a book or something. So yeah, you're beholden that's, I guess, in some ways can be a downside. But, I think, like, Mother Jones, I think, took a pretty big risk in doing that story, legally, but also, and financially, because it costs a lot of money, but also just, like you said, it's, undercover reporting is not, like, a lot of publications don't even allow it. And they, publications say that, tend to justify that on ethical reasons, although the ethics, as Brooke Kroger wrote about in her book, the ethics happen to the change in ethics happened to coincide with lawsuits, and, I think a lot of publications are afraid of getting sued. But yeah, I mean, they could have run that story and got burned in many ways, but they didn't, and people were pretty into it.
There's some hands raised on the far side over there. Could you pass the mic?
Hi, Shane. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us. Funnily enough, I think you and I have actually met. I met you and Sarah, I think, at an Amnesty International conference several years ago, shortly after your release. So I'm glad to meet you under a very different circumstance. But I did have a question kind of related to kind of the ultimate, I think, end game, I think, of your reporting. I'm sure when you were doing this, it was not hard for you, and I'm sure you were worried about the repercussions for the prisoners. So I'm wondering, like, do you feel that the results, I think there may have been some policy changes that came about as a result of your reporting. I know Louisiana was maybe reconsidering the CCA contract. So I'm curious to know, like, whether you think, like, in the end, was it worth it, like, putting myself through that and putting, like, obviously you got a lot of buzz, but in terms of, like, practical outcomes, do you feel that it was worth it kind of doing what you did?
I mean, I think it was worth it just on the story. I mean, I felt good about the story and felt like I succeeded in what I was setting out to do more than I expected. And I wouldn't say that story caused changes, but they coincided. It's hard to say what is cause and effect in these kind of things. But the Department of Justice, a few weeks after the story came out, announced that they were ending the use of private prisons. And I never expected anything like that, and I didn't do the story for that reason. It was good to hear that, I'm not going to lie about that. I mean, it's not, but I felt like, my kind of framework for what is a story successful is, can I show how the system works and the complexities of it, and I felt like I was able to do that, so I felt happy about it before we published it.
Another question way over there.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I have a question about, you spoke a little bit about this earlier, but I'm a lawyer, so I'm very interested in the legal implications of what you do. And if you are doing undercover with a lawless narco-trafficking ban, I mean, the risks there, you could get killed. When you are out, things should be okay. But when you are doing undercover with institutional actors, whether it's here or elsewhere, both of you are always saying the lawyers are so important. And I mean, it makes sense that they are. But I want to understand what would be good lawyering to support the kind of journalism that you do. I mean, when you are talking, you said something that is interesting from a lawyer's perspective, which is, it won't destroy my life. But in the case of the place that does support this kind of journalism, I would like you to please walk us through how they have it set it up, were the lawyers helpful and how, if they weren't, how could they have been helpful? And how did they help you assess the risks? Because you understand that there is a risk no matter how many lawyers you got from Mother Jones.
Yeah, and I should add to that insurance is a big part of that. It's not just lawyers, it's also media insurance. If we get sued, it won't tank the organization, But, I mean, we consulted with lawyers as soon as I start getting calls for interviews, and we start talking to lawyers. We talk to them, because state law differs. Every state is different around these questions. So we had our lawyers look at Louisiana and Oklahoma, which were two states that I was thinking about going to. And we found that in Louisiana, corporations do not have privacy rights. So that was a big benefit. And I think in Oklahoma they do. You know, our lawyer basically just did try to do a quick kind of assessment of risk. He couldn't do a full, thorough thing at that point, but you know, looked at the Food Lion case, how that could potentially impact us. Just questions of, you know, he brought up questions of, you know, non-disclosure agreements, if I have to sign those, you know, just bureaucratic things like how to deal with insurance, like if they, just insurance from the job, you know, health insurance, because I already have insurance, so there's like these kind of weird little legal things. Workers' comp, like, you know, they had workers' comp for me in case I got hurt. And then we basically, then the lawyers came back in the picture when James got arrested. James was a videographer who came down to shoot some video. He had been once before, and he was shooting video just kind of the area. He was shooting kind of interviews with me, just kind of, because I had been filming myself every day when I came home from work and just kind of just talking about what happened. But he came back to do kind of like a more broad stroke kind of thing, film me doing stuff, and then he was getting shots of the prison at night, and he got arrested and was in jail overnight. So then the lawyers came back in for that. They just like jumped on that and just threw everything at, you know, the Wayne County Sheriff to get James out of jail. And then there was a long period of legal reviews of the story. And I'm not going to lie, that is a very frustrating process, and it's not fun as a writer to go through that process because lawyers can be the enemies of good sentences. But you know, that is when, you know, our lawyers really, I mean, he wrote like a 45-page memo on the legal risks of the story, and then my editors are assessing that, taking that and deciding like, what risks can they take? What risks should we not take? And I was part of that conversation. You know, this stuff is very complicated. It's like the legal risks is the journalistic questions. You know, of like, I mean, we didn't pull any punches, but you know, there's still like he would go through things and find things that maybe we didn't find about, like, well, maybe you could identify this person based on this one detail, you know. So that was helpful. And yeah, then there's like a bunch of categories basically where, you know, the lawyer's saying this is a big risk if you do this, this is a moderate risk, this is a small risk, and then the editors and our CEO go through it and make the call, you know, on how much risk they're willing to take. And they took a high amount of risk, you know. But yeah, I mean, he was always saying to us, like, yeah, even if you take all of my advice, you still might get sued. But, you know, and the question of getting sued also, I mean, the real issue is that there's the question of getting sued successfully, but then there's the question of just getting sued. And that is not something that can be prevented, no matter what you do. I mean, and like, we felt, and I felt very confident that, you know, we are secure. I mean, I didn't, you know, the kind of big things that people get sued over in doing this kind of work, you know, have to do with lying, and I never did. And, you know, the company had sent us threatening letters, kind of threatening to sue us, and in a way, yeah, it was hard to work under that, you know, pressure, getting those letters, but at the same time, it was clear they didn't have anything, you know, I mean, so in a way it was kind of reassuring, you know, because there wasn't the stuff that they were trying to scare us about, they had no legal basis for, a lawsuit. So it's good just having somebody pouring through that stuff,
Want to pass the microphone back to the front?
Yeah, thank you also for a really wonderful discussion of all these issues. I was really interested when you mentioned the the issue of siloing, the fact that this story that has made such a big splash in our world and was validated yesterday again for being extraordinary work on many different platforms, never really reaching the militia people that you were spending time with at that time. And in a room full of young journalists, would you have like any idea about how to reach some of the people that you were spending time with at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about that a lot now. I mean, how many people in this room read Breitbart? Yeah, it's like funny, but like they think of it the same way, and while those things are not equivalent, I would not say that reading Jones is equivalent to reading Breitbart, and not just because it's like not just a matter of politics, it's a matter of a journalistic process and fact. But nevertheless, that's not what a lot of the people that read Breitbart believe. They just believe that like this other stuff is wrong and it's skewed and it's lies and all this stuff. And I don't know how to penetrate that. I have been happy about the response to those stories, both of those stories, and I still get emails from people that say, I got an email recently from somebody who basically said like, I despise Mother Jones and liberal media, and I generally support prisons, but this story really affected me, and it changed the way I see this. I don't know how that person got this story. That's really the question. I've been like thinking about this just in terms of like social media and Twitter and stuff. And I was recently, last week, there was this huge eruption in Berkeley after this guy Milo's Breitbart editor was speaking, and there was like riots, fires, and I was there taking pictures, like posting it on Twitter, and that stuff. Those things, they got retweeted a lot, and I saw like a world that I never see on Twitter because it went into the right, and so I was getting tons of reaction that I normally don't get, and like people don't even react to my stories like from that perspective on Twitter, normally. But then it was like I didn't know these people were on Twitter, honestly. I didn't realize that there was such a big presence, and I don't know, like how do you cross over? I had a little Twitter interaction with Richard Spencer, who's the head of the alt-right, and I've been thinking like how you have access, like to everyone, kind of, who's on the platform. How do you engage? How do you like cross over? I don't have the answer, but I think it is a really important question, and it's just more and more these worlds are getting further and further apart, and that's dangerous. I was recently I was at home in Minnesota, and that is also a really different world from the one I'm normally in, and people were warning me never to go to Chicago, I assume because of a Trump tweet, and I'm just like, when I hear that stuff, I'm like, I don't like, how do you even begin to start that conversation? Like what that means, I don't know, but it's important.
Any more questions? Yeah, could you pass the mic all the way over here? Maybe we'll take 2 more questions.
Yes, I wanted to ask you both, what surprised you the most about your experience working in a prison? It seems like such a foreign environment to us. I've never been in one, but having read this.
Huh. I know my answer.
You
wanna go first?
Yeah, you start. All right.
There are two things that I'll say. One is I was really surprised at how thin the line was between prisoners and guards at this prison. They were often clashing, but there was a sense of camaraderie at the same time, or of solidarity, kind of, basically on their shared disdain for the company. Everyone there felt exploited, other than maybe like the top supervisors. And a lot of them knew each other from childhood. They're all pretty much same socioeconomic class. And a lot of the guards are, selling drugs. They're selling drugs in the prison.
That's how drugs get in.
Yeah. But also, I guess a thing that surprised me was just the experience of being a guard. I mean, after being a prisoner for 2 years, it was like I'd spent time in prison. I knew prison pretty well, although it was a very different prison. And I didn't see it as black and white. I mean, when I was a prisoner, there were some guards that were helpful with me, some that were terrible. Most were just kind of ambivalent, but they were still guards, and I didn't, I would never have thought any of them could be a friend, even the ones that were helpful. And I still don't. I mean, I also saw that as a guard from the other side, that you can't, as friendly as I could be with somebody, I'm locking the door, and there's no friendship that can be based on, that relationship. But it was made much more complex, the world of these guards, and especially in this situation where they're just poor people, mostly trying to make a living and don't have other options,
So at Sing Sing, whenever a new prisoner comes in, we were reminded by our sergeant that they often come in groups, and we were told as a group, if we know any of these new prisoners from outside, we have to explain that. We have to tell our supervisors, because I think particularly at downstate prisons in New York, the staff are more likely to come from the metro area, and that's where the prisoners come from. And sometimes they went to junior high or high school together, and often they know each other. And I was surprised by that. I was surprised by, just in the building where I spent most of my time, there was a prisoner called Twin. That was his nickname. And I said, "Oh, so you're a twin, huh?" And he said, "Yeah, my brother's on W Gallery."
Wow.
Yeah. And then another prisoner, his uncle, was on the other side of the same building. And another prisoner I heard about had his father in a different building. And that is upsetting. That's deeply upsetting when you hear that. A woman in my corrections training academy class wanted to be assigned to Bedford Hills, the women's maximum security prison in Westchester County. And it was 2 years later that they realized her mother was a prisoner there. And she had never told anybody. And when they discovered it, she was fired. But you hear that, and you just think, this is awful. This is awful. Two other things that were surprising to me. One was that it only took a few months before I saw and had to recognize a hard part of my character that was able to be a prison guard, that could be the disciplinarian and say no all day long. I didn't like that part of me, but I had to acknowledge it was there. And that made it a lot harder to demonize guards as a class, right? You realize that the job makes people act a certain way. And the institution makes people act a certain way. And so what shows strength of character is people who can resist these institutional pressures to be a certain way. And if you're a prisoner, maybe it's to not hang out with people outside your ethnic group. That's a huge, huge pressure in New York State prisons to do that. Even if you had friends from another group when you went in, you can't when you're there. That was a big surprise. And I guess just the final surprise is the scale of the waste, the wasted money, and keeping so many people locked up for so long. And then the waste of lives, of people just, serving sentences that seem far out of proportion to what they did. And a third of the people I was with had committed murder, which is a horrific thing to do, but is the solution invariably to put somebody in prison until they're 75 years old. I don't think that's imaginative. And so what's stunning and still stunning to me is how much we unthinkingly pour into this system year after year with no energy to improving it. One reason I was happy to see Shane's article is my book didn't fix much. We could use another score of journalists reporting on this, and maybe we'd get somebody's attention. Question way over there.
So my question is, how aware were you of how you were being perceived by the people around you? How did the guards think of you? How did the inmates think of you? What was their impression? And how self-conscious were you of that?
Both of us had prisoners make fun of the way we walk.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to talk about.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
I was just trying to think, is that how people saw me? It's always hard to tell. I mean, the web of power in prison is so complex, and you can never know if somebody says something to you, is that because what they think, or that's just a strategic thing to do, So people made fun of how I walked a lot, and people would catcall me, say homophobic things all the time, and I'd never dealt with that before. One side outcome of this project is that one, it made me realize I've never been catcalled in my life. And it was wow, a lot of people deal with this every day. So it made me think about that differently, or just be more aware of it. Yeah, I don't know. People would kind of prisoners would seize on things and the trick is, in the way that a thing that made me harden so fast is that the worst thing you can do is show anybody that they have any influence over you. So, if I'd be doing count and walking through a dorm and people would be talking about how I walk or making rape jokes or something, I would have to not react. And sometimes, I wrote about one time that I just kind of blew up, and because it's hard sometimes to just not react over and over again. A thing that was really hard for me to deal with is there was this one tier that people just would always say that I was racist, and it's man, these guys are smart, because that was really hard not to react to and try to not disprove, but I felt like I couldn't, because then I would be showing a lever that they had. That world is so twisted. It's the normal ways that you, normally if somebody said that, I would hope that I would ask them to tell me more about why they're saying that, or why they think I'm racist or something, and something would come out of that. But that's the opposite of what you should do in that role. And then guards, I mean, I feel like guards just thought I was like a really good guard. I mean, because I would do stuff. I mean, I wouldn't like, you know, because there was like, part of being there as a journalist is that I basically, I guess going back to the rules, was that, you know, I kind of told myself that I would do the job like the way that I was supposed to do it. And things came up, like I found a cell phone once, the first phone I found, and there was a moment where I was like, should I just leave this? Like, I would have wanted this if I was a prisoner, you know? But then it was like, okay, this is my job to do this, and I'm writing about this, and like I'm, you know, so that was the framework. But just in doing that kind of set me way apart from a lot of the guards. And also I had to like at some point say, well, I can't actually do the job. Like nobody can do the job really by the book. And if I do this too much, I'm really going to stand out, you know. But I think they also thought that I was a little bit, I don't know. I would really get pissed, you know. Some people, I mean, a lot of people did. It was just normal to blow up, you know. But they would notice that, you know. I noticed that because the thing is, like, I think a lot of guards would go in, and there's kind of two directions people go. One is they kind of go the like they want to be like nice guards way, which ends up meaning that like they have to, if they want to stay there, they have to not really do the job, you know. If they want to be like kind of interact with prisoners as like regular human beings, then they have to not do the job, and they're kind of a burden, or they have to harden, you know. And I don't know. So I guess, yeah, people kind of noticed, and I think a lot of people actually don't take the hardening route. They just don't do it, you know. I think that's notable for some people.
There's also also every prison has its own local culture, and
right, yeah.
The one you described in your article sounds pretty permissive. Like a lot of guards just, they're not paying me enough to report that phone.
Yeah. Totally.
And where I worked at Sing Sing was mocked by officers at upstate prisons for being loose and full of officers who were overly accommodating.
Yeah.
They said, yeah, if you come up to Clinton, you're not going to hear anybody whistle at a woman.
Wow.
Because he's going to lose his teeth. They'd say things like that.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And you don't know if it's always true.
Yeah.
But because everybody, the macho scale obviously favors, you know, you don't do them any favors at all.
Right,
And yet, I know that prisoners said it's a lot less humane up there. People don't talk to you like a human being.
Huh.
Yeah. So it varies.
Yeah.
Well, totally fun to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks for the good questions,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks.